I'm 34, and until that Wednesday night I genuinely believed my life was stable in the quiet, adult way people brag about once the chaos of their 20s settles down. Madeline and I had been together almost 5 years, long enough that our routines felt permanent. We lived in a renovated loft in River North, Chicago, all exposed brick and tall windows overlooking streets that never really slept. That place felt like proof that we were building something solid. We had shared furniture, shared bills, shared friends, even a shared espresso machine that neither of us knew how to properly clean. I thought we were past the fragile stage. That night was completely ordinary. I was on the couch reading, half listening to the hum of traffic below and the faint clicking of her keyboard from the kitchen island. She had been preparing for a corporate consulting project in Singapore, 3 weeks overseas, long flights, big clients. I remember thinking I was proud of her ambition. Then she closed her laptop in a slow, deliberate way that instantly shifted the air in the room. She walked over, sat across from me, and said we needed to talk. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She said we should put the relationship on pause while she was in Singapore. She described it as healthy space, as a reset, as something mature people do when they need clarity. She emphasized that it wasn't a breakup. She kept repeating that word, pause, like it was neutral and harmless. 3 weeks, she said. Just 3 weeks to breathe and think. What she expected from me was obvious. She expected shock, maybe anger, maybe a desperate attempt to convince her that we were fine. I could see it in the way she watched my face after every sentence, waiting for a reaction she could manage. Instead, I felt something colder and quieter settle in my chest. It wasn't heartbreak, at least not immediately. It was awareness. I put my book down and looked at her and said, "Okay. If that's what you need." The confusion in her eyes was instant and almost childlike. She blinked like she hadn't heard me correctly. There was no argument, no negotiation, no dramatic speech about 5 years of memories. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even ask questions. And that unsettled her more than any anger would have. In that moment I understood something I hadn't wanted to see before. She wanted freedom without consequences. She wanted the experience of being unattached in another country, in a different time zone, surrounded by new people and late nights, but she also wanted the security of knowing I would still be here in our loft, watering the plants and waiting. She wanted a trial separation with guaranteed stability at the end of it. My calm wasn't surrender. It was observation. If she needed to see what life looked like without me, then I finally had permission to see what life looked like without her. I realized how much of myself I had quietly shaped around her needs, her career moves, her preferences about where we spent holidays and which friends we saw. I had assumed we were a team, but a team doesn't ask for a pause when things get inconvenient or tempting. That night I didn't sleep much. She lay beside me as if nothing had changed, already scrolling through flight details on her phone, while I stared at the ceiling and replayed every small sign I had ignored over the past year. The extra hours at work. The subtle distance. The way she had started talking about independence like it was something she had misplaced. By morning, I wasn't panicking. I was clear. If she wanted space, I would give it to her completely. Not as a punishment, not as a tactic, but as a reality. Because a pause isn't neutral. It reveals who feels safe enough to leave and who has been holding the door open all along. Looking back, it's almost embarrassing how slowly it happened, because it wasn't like Madeline ever sat me down and announced she was taking over my life. She just kept making these tiny, reasonable suggestions that always seemed harmless in the moment, and because I loved her and because I didn't want to be the guy who fought over small stuff, I kept adjusting until my world fit neatly inside the shape she preferred. It started with my friends, the ones I'd had since college, the guys who knew me back when my biggest problem was passing finals and figuring out rent, and she would smile in that polished way of hers and call them immature, not as an insult exactly, more like an observation delivered with a little laugh, as if it was obvious I should have outgrown them by now. At first I defended them, then I started making excuses, and then I started declining invites without even thinking about it, because it was easier to avoid the eye roll and the sigh and the "do you really want to spend your Saturday like that" conversation. The gym was next, because she decided it was a waste of money, and she had a whole logic chain prepared, pointing out how inconsistent I'd been and how we could just work out at home, like it was a sensible budget decision instead of another thread being pulled. I told myself she was right, because I didn't want conflict and I didn't want to admit that the gym was the one place I went where nobody needed anything from me, where I could put my headphones in and exist without explaining myself. When the membership got cancelled, I felt a quick flash of irritation, then I swallowed it and forgot, or at least I told myself I did. The hiking trips were the one thing I thought I'd never give up, because they were mine, because being out on a trail with my phone on airplane mode made my brain feel clean, but she managed to poison even that by calling it juvenile escapism, by saying it like she was teasing me, like she was joking about me pretending to be some outdoorsy guy, until I started hearing her voice in my head every time I considered going, and then the decision stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like something I should be embarrassed about. None of it was dramatic enough to set off alarms. It was just small adjustments over time, a couple degrees off course each month, and I didn't notice I'd been rerouted until I couldn't remember what the original path looked like. So when she left for Singapore and the door clicked shut behind her luggage, the loft didn't feel empty the way I expected it to. It felt honest, like the air finally belonged to itself again. The silence wasn't tense, it was neutral in the best way, not the kind of neutral she used as a disguise, but the kind where nothing is being managed. The first thing I did, almost automatically, was turn on music she used to complain about, the stuff she called noise, and I turned it up louder than I normally would, not to make a point to anyone, just because I could. The bass thumped through the exposed brick, and for the first time in a long time I didn't flinch, waiting for commentary from the kitchen island. The next morning I cooked a greasy breakfast, eggs and bacon and toast soaked in butter, the kind of meal she'd look at like it was a personal failure, and I ate it standing by the window, watching the city wake up, and the fact that nobody was narrating my choices made it taste better. Later I left dishes in the sink, not because I wanted to live in filth, but because I wanted to see what it felt like to do something imperfect without immediately correcting it to avoid criticism. I kept expecting some tight voice behind me saying, "Are you just going to leave that there?" And every time it didn't happen, my shoulders dropped a little more. That afternoon I stared at my phone for a while, thumb hovering over a name I hadn't texted in months, Tyler Morgan, and I realized with a sharp little pang that I had let someone who mattered to me become a ghost in my contacts because it kept the peace at home. I sent a simple message, nothing dramatic, just, "Hey man. You around?" And the response came almost instantly, like he'd been waiting in the wings. "About damn time." I stared at those 3 words and laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh exactly, it was the sound of something unclenching. Autonomy is such a stupid, clinical word, but that's what it was, that sensation of being a full person again instead of a version of myself that had been edited down for compatibility. For years I had been living like my life required approval stamps, and now, with her halfway across the world, I could finally see the first crack in that control, and it wasn't terrifying like I thought it would be, it felt like relief. By the 4th day of her trip, the initial rush of freedom had settled into something more analytical, and I realized that if I was going to understand what had just happened to my relationship, I needed someone who wasn't emotionally invested in either of us, so I booked an appointment with Dr. Laura Bennett in Lincoln Park, making it very clear to myself that this was not couples counseling and not some strategic move to fix us, but simply a conversation about me. Sitting in her office felt strangely exposing, not because of anything dramatic, but because I had spent years narrating my relationship in a way that made it sound stable and reasonable, and now I had to describe it without polishing it first. I explained the pause exactly as Madeline had framed it, the language about clarity and healthy space and reset, and while I was talking I could hear how careful I still was to make it sound mature, like we were 2 evolved adults making a thoughtful decision instead of one person quietly detaching while the other tried to keep up. Dr. Bennett didn't interrupt me. She just listened, hands folded in her lap, eyes steady, not judging, not nodding in exaggerated sympathy, just present in a way that made it impossible for me to perform. When I finished, she asked a question that landed harder than I expected. She said, "Did she pause her behavior, or just your obligation to respond?" For a second I genuinely did not understand what she meant, because I had been so focused on the word pause as something mutual. Then it clicked. Madeline had not paused anything about herself. She had not promised to reconsider her expectations or examine her own patterns. The only thing on hold was my role as a partner with needs, reactions, and boundaries. I was the one being asked to freeze in place while she experimented with distance. I started describing things I had never laid out in a straight line before, like how every hobby I cared about somehow required approval, how even something as small as going to the gym or planning a hiking weekend had to pass through an invisible filter of whether it aligned with her vision of who I should be. I told Dr. Bennett how every plan with friends turned into a negotiation, how I would present it carefully, almost like a proposal, anticipating objections before they were spoken. I explained how disagreements rarely exploded into shouting matches, because Madeline did not yell, she reframed, She repositioned the narrative until I was no longer arguing about the original issue but defending my loyalty, my maturity, my commitment. If I pushed back, the conversation would shift into an emotional audit of my dedication to the relationship, and suddenly the topic was not the cancelled gym membership or the hiking trip or the dinner with friends, but whether I was fully invested in us. She had a way of withdrawing just enough warmth to make me uneasy, of becoming distant and cool without saying outright that she was upset, which forced me to chase reassurance and correct whatever misstep I had apparently made. It was control without obvious cruelty, subtle enough that I could never point to a single explosive moment and say, "There, that was wrong." Dr. Bennett listened to all of this without dramatizing it, and then she said something that felt like a summary of the past 5 years. She said, "She wanted flexibility, you were expected to remain fixed." The simplicity of that statement stripped away all the complicated language I had been using to justify things. Madeline could evolve, shift, demand space, redefine terms, explore independence, but I was supposed to remain stable, patient, supportive, unchanged, like an anchor that never questioned the tide. That was the moment something shifted in me. Up until then, even in therapy, I had been subtly defending her, explaining her stress, her career pressure, her need for growth. I had been framing myself as the reasonable partner who just needed to adjust better. But sitting there, hearing the pattern laid out without accusation or drama, I realized I had been shrinking in increments so small I barely noticed. The pause was not a sudden rupture. It was the logical extension of a dynamic where her needs expanded and mine contracted. For the first time since she left, I stopped constructing arguments in my head that justified her behavior. I stopped trying to reinterpret her request as something generous or enlightened. I allowed myself to consider that maybe the healthiest thing happening in this entire situation was not her search for clarity in Singapore, but my decision to look at the pattern without protecting it. A couple of days after that therapy session, Tyler decided thinking wasn't enough and told me to meet him at an old-school boxing gym in Pilsen, the kind of place that doesn't have a smoothie bar or motivational neon signs on the walls, just scuffed floors, dented lockers, heavy bags hanging in uneven rows, and the thick smell of leather and sweat that hits you the second you walk in. There were no influencers filming themselves, no curated playlists, just the steady rhythm of gloves hitting canvas and people breathing hard. It felt raw in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The trainer, Frankie Russo, looked me over like I was a used car he was considering buying, not impressed, not dismissive, just assessing. He wrapped my hands himself the first day and said, "Good. No bad habits yet." I knew he was talking about boxing technique, but the comment lodged somewhere deeper because it sounded like a verdict on more than just my stance. No bad habits yet meant I wasn't too far gone, that whatever version of myself I had let get passive and compliant wasn't permanent. I trained 3 times that week. The first session left my knuckles burning even through the wraps and gloves, my shoulders trembling every time I tried to keep my guard up. My lungs felt like they were scraping against my ribs as Frankie barked simple instructions that were somehow impossible to execute once fatigue set in. There was no room to overthink in that gym. You either moved or you got hit by the bag swinging back at you. By the second session my body protested before I even stepped through the door, but I went anyway, and by the third I noticed something shift, not in strength exactly but in focus. The constant background noise in my head, the analysis of Madeline's words, the urge to decode her texts, started to quiet down because my body demanded full attention. Meanwhile, my phone lit up more often with messages from Singapore. The time difference made them arrive at strange hours, little digital taps on my nightstand that used to spike my anxiety. She wrote that she missed me, that she hoped I was okay, that I seemed distant. I read each message carefully and replied politely but briefly, answering the direct questions and nothing more. I did not offer emotional essays or reassurance disguised as vulnerability. I did not fill the silence she left between her updates about rooftop bars and client dinners. I noticed that the more measured I was, the more frequent her messages became, like she was probing for something to leak out of me. In the past I would have rushed to reassure her, to prove I was still invested, to maintain the emotional temperature she preferred. Now I kept my responses simple and factual. If she asked how my day was, I told her I went to work and trained. If she said she missed me, I said I hoped her project was going well. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't performative either. I realized she had expected a certain level of emotional exposure from me, the kind that confirmed she still had access to my internal world even while physically distant. Instead, she was getting boundaries, and boundaries feel like rejection to someone who is used to unrestricted entry. That weekend Tyler hosted a small gathering at his apartment, nothing dramatic, just a few of the guys I hadn't seen in over 2 years, takeout containers stacked on the counter, cheap beer sweating onto coasters, music playing too loudly in the background. I felt awkward at first, aware of the gap in time, aware that I had let these friendships fade because it was easier than defending them. But the awkwardness dissolved faster than I expected. Conversation slipped back into old rhythms, inside jokes resurfaced, and at some point I laughed in a way that surprised me because it wasn't polite laughter or restrained amusement, it was loud and unfiltered and came from somewhere deeper than I remembered. In the middle of that noise one of the guys looked at me for a second longer than usual and said quietly, almost casually, that I looked like myself again. He didn't elaborate and he didn't need to. The comment stayed with me long after I left, echoing in the quiet of the loft later that night. I realized I had not felt like myself in a long time, not fully, not without edits. That single observation carried more weight than any message lighting up my phone from across the world, because it wasn't about maintaining a connection, it was about recovering an identity I hadn't realized I'd misplaced. Midway through the 3rd week, right when I had settled into a rhythm that felt stable and self-contained, my phone rang with her name flashing across the screen instead of the usual string of messages, and the unexpectedness of the call alone told me something had shifted. When I answered, her voice was shaky in a way I had rarely heard, not the controlled vulnerability she used during difficult conversations, but something less rehearsed. She said she thought she had made a mistake asking for space, and the sentence came out uneven, like she had practiced it and still wasn't sure how it would land. She admitted she hadn't expected me to be so calm about everything. She said she thought I would fight for us, that I would push back, that I would at least argue. There was an edge under her words, a confusion that sounded almost like accusation, as if my composure had violated an unspoken agreement. I realized in that moment that my reaction had disrupted the script she assumed we were following. The pause was supposed to provoke urgency in me, to confirm that I was still anchored to her, still orbiting her decisions. I listened without interrupting, not out of detachment but because I genuinely didn't feel the urge to defend myself anymore. She talked about clarity and how being away had made her realize what we had was important, but the tone underneath wasn't relief, it was instability. I could hear it in the way she circled back to my behavior, to how distant I seemed, to how different I sounded. It wasn't that she missed me in a simple, direct way. It was that the version of me she expected to remain constant had shifted, and she had no control over that shift. When she told me she was changing her flight and coming back 4 days early, she framed it as a decision driven by love, by realization, by wanting to fix things immediately. But what I sensed for the first time was panic, not romantic desperation, but the kind of panic that surfaces when influence starts slipping. For years I had been predictable. Even my disagreements followed patterns she could navigate. Now she was facing something unfamiliar, a version of me who wasn't reacting on cue. While she was in the air heading back to Chicago, I did something that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Instead of waiting at the loft rehearsing conversations in my head, I toured apartments in West Loop. The neighborhood felt different from River North, less polished, more grounded, and walking through those spaces alone felt surreal. Leasing agents talked about square footage and lease terms while I calculated something entirely different in my head, the cost of autonomy, the weight of a decision made without consultation. One unit in particular stood out, not because it was extravagant, but because it felt neutral, unclaimed, like a blank page. As I stood in the empty living room, sunlight cutting across the hardwood floor, I realized no one was there to ask whether it was practical, whether it aligned with long-term plans, whether it made sense for both of us. The silence wasn't lonely. It was decisive. I put down a deposit that same day. Move-in was scheduled for 2 weeks after her return. I did not tell her. Not out of spite, not to create drama, but because for once I wanted to experience what it felt like to make a major decision that did not require a joint negotiation, a presentation, or a defense. I signed the paperwork with my own name, on my own timeline, and when I walked back out onto the street, the city noise sounded sharper, clearer. It wasn't about leaving her in that exact moment. It was about recognizing that I no longer needed permission to change the direction of my own life. As her plane crossed the ocean, she likely believed she was coming back to restore balance, to reclaim something that had temporarily slipped. Meanwhile, I had already stepped into a different mental space, one where my choices did not revolve around preserving her comfort. For the first time in 5 years, I made a decision that belonged entirely to me, and I did it quietly, without seeking validation, without announcing it as a threat. It was simply mine. When Madeline walked back into the loft, suitcase wheels rattling over the hardwood floor, the first thing she noticed was not me but the subtle evidence that something had shifted in her absence. Her eyes landed on the boxing gloves resting on the arm of the couch, on the new pair of running shoes by the door, on the absence of the careful neatness she used to curate. She paused in the middle of the living room and looked around slowly, like she was scanning for something she couldn't immediately name. Then she said it felt different here, and her voice carried a mix of confusion and caution. I told her it was different, and I didn't soften it. The air between us felt heavier than any argument we had ever had, because this wasn't reactive, it was deliberate. She set her bag down and stepped closer, studying my face as if she were trying to find the version of me she had left behind. When she started crying, it came suddenly, without the usual composure she maintained during difficult conversations. She said she had been scared, that she needed to know if she could be happy on her own, that the distance had made her realize how much I meant to her. But woven through that confession was another truth she eventually voiced, that she didn't want to lose me while figuring that out. I listened carefully and felt a strange calm settle in my chest, the kind that comes when a realization has already solidified long before the confrontation. I told her that what she was describing was not partnership, that wanting to test independence while keeping me secured in place was not love in its healthiest form. I told her it sounded like insurance, like she wanted coverage in case her experiment with distance didn't yield the results she hoped for. The word landed between us harder than I expected. She wiped her face and looked at me like I had become someone unfamiliar. I began listing the patterns, not angrily, not rapidly, but clearly, describing how over the years my friendships had thinned, how my hobbies had required approval, how every disagreement had somehow transformed into a question of my loyalty rather than a discussion about the issue itself. I talked about the subtle isolation, the way I had adjusted piece by piece until I barely recognized the shape of my own life. I was not raising my voice, and that seemed to unsettle her more than shouting would have. She accused me of keeping score, of tallying grievances in secret instead of communicating them in the moment. The accusation might have worked on an earlier version of me, because I would have rushed to clarify that I wasn't attacking her, that I still cared, that I didn't mean it that way. This time I corrected her calmly. I told her I wasn't keeping score, I was recognizing patterns, and there is a difference between the two. One is about winning, the other is about understanding what has been happening beneath the surface. When I finally told her about the new lease in West Loop, I watched the color drain from her face in real time. It wasn't theatrical shock, it was a quiet, dawning realization that the stability she assumed was waiting had already shifted. She asked if I was really leaving, and there was a tremor in her voice that I had rarely heard before, not because she was incapable of emotion but because she was used to guiding the emotional temperature of the room. I told her that in many ways we had both left 3 weeks ago, the moment she decided she needed to explore life without me while expecting me to remain unchanged. I said I had just caught up to that reality. The statement was not cruel, and it was not dramatic. It was simply accurate from where I stood. I had spent years bending to maintain the shape of us, and somewhere along the way I had mistaken flexibility for commitment. Now, standing in the same loft that once felt like proof of permanence, I felt something different, not anger, not even heartbreak in its sharpest form, but clarity. After that night she moved into her sister's condo temporarily, telling me it would give us both space to think, but by then space no longer felt like a threat to me, it felt like oxygen. The first week after she left the loft for good was strangely quiet, not in a lonely way but in a way that forced everything to settle. Then the messages started to change in tone and frequency. Around midnight my phone would light up with long apology texts, paragraphs unpacking her fears, her childhood patterns, her stress, her regret. She wrote about accountability and growth and how she hadn't realized how much pressure she had put on me. I read every word carefully, not because I was looking for something to argue against, but because I wanted to be sure I wasn't dismissing something genuine. Still, I didn't feel the pull to rush back in. When apologies didn't create the reaction she hoped for, the tone shifted. She told me I had changed, and she didn't say it like a compliment. She said I was colder, more distant, less willing to fight for us. It was strange to hear growth framed as betrayal, as if my refusal to collapse back into the old rhythm was an act of aggression. I answered calmly each time, keeping my responses measured and brief, never escalating, never attacking. I didn't insult her or catalog her flaws. I simply declined to step back into a dynamic that had required me to compress myself. She suggested couples therapy next, framing it as a mature solution, as proof that she was willing to do the work. Months earlier I would have agreed immediately, eager to demonstrate commitment. Now I understood that therapy only works when both people are prepared to confront patterns without trying to preserve control. I told her I was already in therapy for myself and that I needed to continue focusing on that. She brought up the 5 years we had spent together, the trips, the holidays, the shared lease, as if the length of time alone could justify resuming something that had been quietly eroding. I acknowledged those years without dismissing them, but I refused to treat them as debt that obligated me to return. While those cycles played out, my life began to solidify in ways that felt tangible. I trained harder at the boxing gym, no longer just hitting heavy bags but sparring competitively, stepping into the ring with people who did not care about my backstory and would expose hesitation instantly. There is something clarifying about being hit and realizing you are still standing, about learning to protect yourself without apology. My knuckles toughened, my footwork improved, and with every session I felt less like someone recovering from something and more like someone building forward. I rebuilt friendships deliberately, not by apologizing excessively for my absence but by showing up consistently. I attended birthdays, hosted small dinners at my new apartment in West Loop, laughed without checking my phone. The awkwardness of reconnecting faded as repetition replaced guilt. At work I redirected the mental energy that had once gone into managing tension at home, and I noticed how much sharper my focus became when I wasn't preoccupied with emotional negotiations. Projects that had once felt draining became straightforward challenges, and when promotion discussions came around again, I advocated for myself clearly instead of downplaying my contributions. The promotion I had been overlooked for twice finally came through, and for the first time I accepted it without wondering how it would affect someone else's sense of balance. 6 weeks after she moved out, she asked if I would reconsider, and the question arrived without theatrics, almost exhausted. When we met to talk, she searched my face for signs of hesitation, for cracks she could widen. I felt no anger toward her, only a steady understanding of what I needed. I told her I did not want a relationship where I had to shrink to fit, where my growth triggered instability instead of support. The sentence came out simply, without emphasis, but it carried the weight of everything I had recognized over the past month and a half. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it. For once there was no reframing, no redirecting the conversation into my shortcomings, no appeal to history. There was just silence, and in that silence I understood that the dynamic had finally ended not with an explosion, but with clarity. 6 months after the night she asked to put us on pause, I ran into Madeline at a coffee shop in Wicker Park on a gray Saturday morning when the city felt slow and unguarded. I had just finished a run along the trail and stopped in for coffee without thinking about who I might see, and when I turned from the counter with my cup in hand, she was standing a few feet away waiting for her order. For a second we both froze, not dramatically, just long enough to register that the other person was real and present and no longer filtered through memory or a phone screen. She looked different, not in a way that could be traced to a new haircut or different clothes, but in posture, in the way her shoulders seemed slightly drawn inward. There was a tiredness around her eyes that I didn't remember, and something about her felt smaller, as if the certainty she used to carry had softened. She smiled first, polite and careful, and we exchanged the kind of neutral greeting people use when they share history but not proximity. We sat down at a small table by the window and traded updates in measured tones. I told her about work, about the promotion, about moving into West Loop and how the place finally felt like home. She nodded and said she was still consulting, still traveling, still figuring things out. There was no accusation in her voice anymore, no attempt to pull me into an emotional current. The conversation was steady, almost professional, which felt surreal given how entangled our lives had once been. At one point she looked at me directly and said she finally understood what I meant about control, about how subtle it had been and how easy it was to justify at the time. She didn't defend herself. She didn't minimize it. She just said she had started noticing similar patterns in other areas of her life and that it had forced her to reflect. I listened and nodded, not because I was indifferent, but because I didn't feel the need to dissect it. Her realization was hers to manage, not something I needed to validate or argue against. What surprised me most was the absence of emotional turbulence inside my own chest. I wasn't angry anymore, and I wasn't secretly hopeful that this was the beginning of a second attempt. I wasn't scanning her words for hidden meanings or waiting for an opening to assert something. I just felt steady, grounded in a way that would have been impossible a year earlier. The version of me who had once measured his reactions against her expectations was gone. When she stood up to leave, she hesitated for a fraction of a second as if considering whether to say something more significant, then simply wished me well. I returned the sentiment honestly. As she walked out of the shop and disappeared into the street traffic, I stayed seated for a moment, watching the door close behind her. There was no dramatic sense of loss, no triumphant relief, just clarity. I realized then that a pause only works if both people freeze in place, suspended in the exact same emotional position until someone decides to press play again. But life does not freeze, and growth does not wait patiently for mutual timing. While she believed she could step away, test the waters, and return to the same version of me standing exactly where she left him, I had been moving, quietly but consistently. I had rebuilt parts of myself that had been compressed, strengthened boundaries that once felt negotiable, and redefined what partnership meant in practical terms rather than romantic language. She had thought the pause would preserve the relationship in stasis, like pressing a button on a remote. Instead, it revealed that I was capable of evolving without her permission. And sitting there with my coffee cooling in my hands, I understood that the difference between who I was then and who I am now is not loud or dramatic, but it is permanent, and that permanence made everything clear.